All right, well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Megan Jacobs and I'm an associate professor in the Honors College. And today is part of a series of public lectures for the Honors College Discovery Series, which highlights the unique research and methodologies of various scholars. I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the original peoples of this land in which the University of New Mexico is located. The Sandia Pueblo and the Navajo Nation have ties and stories on this land and within the broader community that are connected to New Mexico. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. A little bit of housekeeping before I do our introduction for our esteemed guest today. We are recording this presentation with the intention of placing the video on the Honors College website so others can view it if they weren't able to attend today. So if for some reason you do not want your likeness recorded, that's totally fine. If you could just turn off your camera, we want to respect that and just let you know that this will be recorded. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today. Our speaker is Dr. Kristina Jacobsen, who is an ethnographer, a singer-songwriter, and a cultural anthropologist. She's an associate professor of ethnomusicology and anthropology here at the University of New Mexico. And her research focuses on language, reclamation, expressive culture, popular music, and arts-based research methodologies. Today, Dr. Jacobsen will be presenting her research during her time in Sardinia, Italy, as a US-Italy Fulbright Scholar for the 2019-2020 academic year. She'll be discussing her ethnographic fieldwork in which she learned the Sardinian language. She'll be talking about writing songs with interlocutors in the field and the research method that she calls ethnographic songwriting, and which is going to be information that she's going to be using for her upcoming book, which sounds fascinating, Sing Me Back Home, Songwriting, Sardinian Culture, Reclamation, and Italian Colonialism. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to this amazing guest.
Hey everyone, thank you all so much, and thank you to the Honors College and to Dr. Megan Jacobs for the invitation to share some of my research in progress with you all this afternoon. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces, and even though we're a couple miles away from each other and in some cases further, it feels nice and intimate, so I'm really glad to be here with you all. Also a shout out to my graduate assistant, Sasha Arteaga, for helping with things technical on this presentation today. So I'm going to be talking about my research in Sardinia, as Dr. Jacobs said, and so I'm going to go ahead and pull up a brief slide presentation with some photos, and then we'll talk, and we're also going to be listening to some songs today. So let's okay, can everyone see that okay? Yeah? Okay. Megan, can you see it okay? And can you hear me?
I can hear you just perfectly, but I don't see it on my screen. I just see like a black screen right now. Do other people see?
Yeah, that's what I see too.
The black screen?
Yeah, black screen.
Okay, let's try, I'll share it again. Let's see. Okay. And now?
Yeah, perfect. That's great.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So excited to be giving my first talk on Zoom today. Thank you for bearing with me. So I'm going to be talking about my Fulbright research that I've been doing during my sabbatical year for the last year in Sardinia. And so you'll see here that this, so the orange landmass is the island of Sardinia. You'll see that it's west of Italy and northwest of the island of Sicily and a little bit south of Corsica. And a significant fact about Sardinia is that geographically, you'll see that it's actually closer to North Africa, to Algeria and Tunisia specifically, than it is to the Italian mainland. And this plays a sort of important political role for identities for Sardinians and their sense of attachment or lack thereof to the continente, as it's referred to mainland Italy. And so on the Fulbright end of things, just to say this, I won't be talking a whole lot about nuts and bolts of the Fulbright program today, but if you have questions at the end, or I'm very happy to answer some of those questions. Maybe the most important thing to know if you're a student is that you can apply for Fulbrights up to 5 years after you've graduated, whether that's with a bachelor's degree or a master's or a PhD. So there's a long window of opportunity afterwards, and there's opportunities to teach and do research, and it's a fantastic way to support yourself and travel and do exciting artistic and research projects in a lot of different ways. I also wanted to say just a little housekeeping as I talk today. Absolutely feel free to type questions in the chat, and we have someone that's going to be collecting those and sharing them with us at the end. So if there's something that you want to catch, feel free to sort of actively engage with questions and notes as we go through. And when we listen to the songs, I would recommend, if you have a set of headphones handy and you're not already using headphones, to stick a set of headphones on, because the sound is likely to distort with the sound recordings if you don't have headphones. So in this last year, I was living in a rural mountain village in mid sort of central Sardinia, in a village called Sant'Ulusurgiu, living on a street called Zaccarella, where the famous carnival horse race takes place. And I was living in this old stone house, a 5-story house. This is a photo of it here. And this is the alleyway that was right next to the house. And this is actually going to be one of the images on the album that I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. So this is just to give you a little bit of a sense for the village. It's in a hollowed out extinct volcano, and everyone lives at the bottom of it. And this is a view from the balcony where I was living in Sant'Ulusurgiu. And then, so the work that I was doing when I was in Sardinia, ethnographic fieldwork, as some of you know, can have an it's a very broad umbrella for a lot of different kinds of research. And in my particular case, this included teaching and leading workshops. I was teaching at the University of Cagliari in the city of Cagliari, which is in southern Sardinia. And then I was studying 2 versions of the Sardinian language. There's 4 iterations, and I was studying one called Logudorese and the other in Campidanese. Writing songs with musicians, poets, storytellers, sheep herders, and a lot of different folks from across the island. And playing solo shows as a singer-songwriter, touring, and then sometimes also performing the songs that I was writing with other people to sort of, as a research methodology, to elicit further information and responses. So all of this broadly falls under the rubric of what in anthropology we would call participant observation. And then I was also doing a number of interviews. So here's a couple of photos just to give you sort of a sense, a visual sense of some of those experiences. Here I am with my primary Sardinian language teacher, Francisca Manca, in Sant'Ulusurgiu. And we were doing a performance and a presentation at the Casa Anziani, which is the repose home for folks in the village in Sant'Ulusurgiu. And teaching some guitar lessons here. I got to write my first song in a crypt. This is below a church. With the bassist, the jazz musician Sebastiano Desanay. This is with a very well-known blues musician in Sardinia who writes a lot of his songs in the Sardinian language, and also in Tabarchino named Matteo Leone. This is with a bluegrass musician named Matthew Paperi, who sings bluegrass music, but in another iteration of the Sardinian language. And this is with a jump blues band called La Città di Notte. And this was right after a gig that we'd played in Sardinia as well. This is with another iteration of that bluegrass band called Saddle of the Devil. And this is with a really amazing young accordion player from the village of Sant'Ulusurgiu, with whom I wrote a number of songs. And he ended up also recording on the album. And so that's Matteo there with his accordion. So my research is inspired by a couple different questions that I've been thinking through over the last 6 or 7 years as both a touring and performing singer-songwriter and as an ethnographer and cultural anthropologist. So the first question is how to take songs seriously. And by that I mean how to use songs to inform, feed, generate ethnographic method as a form of research methodology in their own right. And then the second question that I had is sort of a research question is what can we learn about language reclamation, language stigma, and also ordeals of language through study of fine-grained artistic processes and acts of co-creation, such as songwriting. So in this case, writing songs with other people. And so this is inspired, as I said, by the fact that I work as both a performing musician and as an anthropologist. And so it's also an attempt for me to sort of bring these two worlds together, right? And looking at the ways that songwriting and ethnography, and then more broadly, art and social sciences, can productively feed one another or interanimate one another and be mutually generative. So the second sort of challenge to myself in this research is articulating this in the language of academic theory, right? And then also articulating this in the language of songwriting. So what can anthropology give back to songwriting is another way to sort of phrase that question, right? In situ, long-term ethnographic fieldwork, and what might that give us in a particular setting? So much of this research can be understood under the larger aegis of what are now being referred to as arts-based research methodologies. And I'll be providing some sources throughout the talk today, so that if you want to go down specific rabbit holes or you're interested in ideas, you can pursue them further. So one of those that will be provided in the chat is resources on what's known as ethnographic poetry. And so ethnographic poetry is this burgeoning field in anthropology and humanistic anthropology of ethnographers, anthropologists sort of writing about their own fieldwork experiences in poetic form. And oftentimes those will interanimate ethnographies in written text. So you'll have more analytic parts of a text, and then you'll also have poetic parts, and sort of the ways that this informs anthropology in some really, really important ways. And today's presentation is also drawing on some previous research that I've done in this area, and also research by many, many, many others. But here are a couple references and a couple links for those that are interested. So the other part of this research, which I'm very happy to talk about more in the Q&A at the end for those that have questions, is the language component of this. So looking at language reclamation, looking at language shift, and looking at language stigma. This is on an island where historically Sardinian was the primary language spoken by inhabitants there. And then when Sardinia became a part of Italy during unification, Sardi were forced to begin speaking Italian. And so in the era of Mussolini, this became compulsory, so in the 1940s. And so there's been tremendous language loss and language shift, right? Sort of from one dominant mother tongue to the other. And so one of the things that was very interesting to me is to look at new speakers and younger folks that speak Italian and are maybe just learning Sardinian or don't speak it, and sort of how that links to senses of identity and political identity, specifically in Sardinia. And so one of the theoretical concepts that I'm working with for this particular portion of the research is this idea of transduction, and also this idea of cultural translation. And so transduction, just so we're on the same page here, in acoustics, it's talking about converting one form of energy into another, or one form of sound, right? But in music, we can think of transduction in the way that I'm thinking of it, as energy from one genre of music and one language culture that's harnessed to indexically signal another world much closer to home. And so in those ways, and that this validates Sardinian language and traditional music in new ways. So an example here is the use of American roots music in Sardinia. Bluegrass, country music, many of the musicians whose collaborations I showed you photos of earlier. And in this particular case, and part of the argument of the research and of the book, is that American music itself becomes a site of transduction through the process of songwriting, recording, and performance. So it's this idea that Sardi, and particularly younger Sardi, are sort of going abroad sonically, right? And bringing sounds back home to Sardinia, but in order to signify things that are very specific and very grounded in Sardinian identity, right? So sort of the use and incorporation of these particular sounds. So I promised that I would be sharing a couple recordings today. This is the name of the album that will be, so there's 12 songs on the album. It was recorded in June, and the tentative title is House on Swallow Street, and that'll be released with the Sardinian label called Talk About Records. And then the book, as Dr. Jacobs said, is tentatively titled Sing Me Back Home. And so I just finished the recording process for that. As I said at the outset of the talk, it's definitely still a work in progress. And so I'm very excited to sort of get people's thoughts and feedback at this particular stage in the research. The other part of writing songs with other people is to think of it as the broader framework is to think of it as collaborative research. And one definition and a way to think about collaborative research is an approach, in this case to ethnography, that deliberately and explicitly emphasizes collaboration at every point in the ethnographic process, including the conceptualization of the project, fieldwork, and most crucially, the writing at the very end, whether that's a book or the writing of a song. In this particular case, this means writing songs collaboratively with people, but not just writing them, recording them, deciding what the recording is going to sound like, who's on the recording, at the level of the mixing, for those of you that are familiar with the stages of recording, at the very final stage of mastering, right? All of these kind of things can potentially, and in this case have been done collaboratively. And so in those conversations of negotiation, we can learn a lot about a lot of the thematics that I'm super interested in for this particular project, related to identity, to politics, to sound preferences, to aesthetics, and many other things. Just so we're all on the same page, and because I know we have a broad range of folks that are participating today, I'll be referencing the term ethnography a lot, and so I just wanted to make sure we are on the same page. With this, my own working definition of ethnography is an in-depth study of a community at a particular moment in time through the art of deep hanging out, right? Going somewhere, spending extended time, and becoming a part of a given community in some form or another. Some of the things that are important, I think, for us to know today about ethnography that sort of characterize it are, number one, that specificity matters, right? This could be anything from foodways to clothing styles to anything else. But we're going into a place as ethnographers and paying attention on purpose, right? So like all of those little details are super, super important. And the argument being that nothing is too small, right? Ethnography is characterized by participant observation. So we are both an observer and we are a participant. And finding the sort of right balance between those two can be a really interesting goal, and sometimes also a challenging goal in different field sites. Ethnography makes the familiar strange and makes the strange familiar. The best ethnographies humanize individuals and humanize communities. In some cases, communities that perhaps we think we already know, right? And then it sort of, but it puts a human face in part through the art of storytelling, right? With which the best ethnographies do really, really beautiful. As the podcast host to a podcast called Snap Judgment, Glenn Washington says, it's really difficult to hate someone if you know their story, right? So it's sort of this idea of how do we enter into different worlds and different sound universes. The final thing about ethnography that I just want to say here is that for ethnographers and for anthropologists, and when we're writing, right, like getting the facts right is absolutely essential, right? That is sort of our credentials in the field and as scholars. So with songwriting, just to turn to this, there are so many different definitions. And so I wanted to give you mine and sort of my own personal working definition when I'm thinking about songwriting and when I'm thinking about songwriting with others. So for me, songs are a narrative-based art form. The best ones can create an entire world in 3 minutes, which is a tall order, right? And that in the process of songwriting, we often go from being narrated to narrating, to finding voice, to finding our own voice in crucial ways. And so collaboratively with other people, this can be a very powerful thing to do, whether you're telling someone else's story or you're telling your own story, or a combination, as frequently happens, of the two. In songwriting, and this is in contrast to ethnography, there's more of a focus on an emotional truth, right? Is the song believable? Is it credible in the sphere of that particular song and the world that's been created by that songwriter, rather than a literal truth or a sort of journalistic truth, just the facts, that would be more the emphasis in ethnography. But for me, songwriting, and this is probably the most crucial part of a working definition to have here, includes the writing of the words, the melody, the chords, but also songwriting includes the production and the arrangement and the recording and the release and the sharing of the songs, whether that's in live performance or in recordings or circulating on social media and all of those things. So all of that is sort of encapsulated in this definition of songwriting. Are you all with me? Does that make sense as a thing? Okay. So the final thing in terms of definitions that I want to really briefly talk about is a term that I've coined for this latest research project, and that is ethnographic songwriting. So what is ethnographic songwriting? The definition that I'm working with right now is that ethnographic songwriting is writing songs, this could be by myself or with others, as a way to process, recount, share, or elicit ethnographic experience. So in this way, songs, when they're written, for example, collaboratively with others, can become a form of long-form interview, of intercultural exchange, of participant observation that I spoke about earlier, but with a really concrete product at the end, right? You have a song. What sometimes I refer to as like, you have like a song child, right? Like, and it's this very intense thing, and it's this thing that like exists in the world and then takes on multiple lives that are completely out of your control oftentimes, right? But like, you have sort of co-created this thing. I've co-written songs with people now 15, 20 years ago, and it's still an incredibly strong sort of bond to know that you brought into the world, right? This kind of particular artistic creation. And finally, ethnographic songwriting, for a working definition for us today, is ethnographically informed songwriting. Ethnography that takes songs as storytelling and as expressions of self seriously, getting back to some of the earlier thematics that I was talking about. I am sort of working with 4 different definitions for categories of ethnographic songwriting, and so I just wanted to talk about those really briefly. So the first is songs that are written on my own, but that are inspired by the fieldwork experience. And there's some of these on the forthcoming album as well. So this could be histories of a place. In the case of the forthcoming album, one of them is sort of an arrival narrative. So sort of going through culture shock and sort of figuring out how to find my way in this particular place. A second kind of ethnographic songwriting is songs that are written collaboratively, co-written with others as a way to learn, understand, and know more in another cultural context. So one example of this is the song that I wrote with my Sardinian language teacher, Francisca Manca, who you saw a photo of earlier, and she gave me a prompt sort of about my own experience arriving in the village and my experience living in this really huge stone house that was unheated, and sort of what that experience was like. And then I came back to her and we translated the song into Sardinian, and then she sort of added her own languaging and the way that she saw the village sort of infused into that. And then what came out is a song called Terra po approdare, or kind of, or translated as Place to Land, which is a song in the language of the village in Lusorzezu. And so one of the important things that song did, just to give an example, is that it's a song that every time I played it for people in the village elicited a lot of other stories about life and experience in the village. Whether that was someone that was a newcomer that had come from another village, or someone that had always lived there. So it became sort of a device to elicit other stories and to invite storytelling and life stories from other people in those particular ways. A third way that I've been thinking about ethnographic songwriting, and here's where these ideas of transduction and language reclamation come in more specifically, is translations of songs. And to give you one example, so on the album, I ended up taking a couple original country songs that I'd written in English and translating them with collaborators, very, very actively sort of translating them into the Sardinian language. But one of the tricks here is that the goal was to, at the suggestion of my interlocutors, to translate it into a register of speech that would be the equivalent of Southeastern English that you would hear in a country song in the United States, but in Sardinian, right? So like, what register of Sardinian in terms of social class and in terms of positioning and language and habitus, how would that sort of translate from one language culture to another? And then the final thing, and I've already referenced this really briefly, is ethnographic songwriting being used as a method of playback. And what do I mean by playback? So you've already written a song, and you've either recorded it or you're performing it, and then you perform it for someone. It could be the person that you wrote it with. It could be for a focus group. It could be for an audience or anything else. And then you're using that song to elicit feedback about specific themes that maybe that song is focusing on or touches on, right? Songs, and I think this is true for many of us that work in the arts, right? They sort of become counter narratives, but also different ways to access and to gain entry to specific thematics, right? And so songs can do that as well. Yes, you could write a history article about the same theme. Yes, you could write a journalistic article, but it might not access people affectively in quite the same way. And so it can become a very, very powerful tool for asking questions, right? And sort of for entering specific research thematics. Okay, so I mentioned that I did this recording project in June in Sardinia. And so many of the songs were recorded, well, all of them were recorded on this floor. This is the third floor of my house. This is my Labrador that was with me throughout my fieldwork experience. And this is sort of from the balcony. But this is the view that basically happened every morning when we were recording. And so I had a Sardinian recording engineer who had this amazing portable setup. And so the idea was that I wanted the album to be its own sort of ethnographic archive of the experience of living in the village for the year and of writing a lot of the songs in this room and in the house. And so I sort of wanted them recorded in the same place. So that's where most of the recording took place. And we also got a lot of soundscapes. So every morning there's these incredible swooshes of swallows that sort of go down the lane, and then there's a donkey around the corner that brays at a certain time. And so we got field recordings of those sounds, and then they sort of are the backdrop or the background to a lot of the songs on the album. Okay, so I want to share some songs with you all now, and then hopefully to elicit some of your thoughts and your feedback. So I'm going to play you examples of 2 collaboratively written songs. So songs, sort of the type 2 category of that four category schema that I was showing to you all. And these are songs that were written collaboratively with Sardinian songwriters in this particular case. And again, by collaboratively written, in these 2 cases, I mean lyrics, melody, chords, but also recording, production, mastering, absolutely everything. So sort of conversations and negotiations about all of those things as we went through it. And as I play these songs for you, I'll give you a little background and then I'm going to play them for you. I encourage you to type responses or anything else that stays with you in the chat as we go through. So I'm teaching a songwriting class this semester, and one of the things I tell my songwriting students, some of whom are with us today, is if a particular line, in this case, stays with you, you can just repeat the line. You can just write that right into the chat. And that's very useful data for songwriters, right? Like, oh, cool, okay, that line resonated, or that particular part was meaningful. So it can be a very simple response of a repetition if you'd like, or of course, anything else that comes to mind. So the first song that I'm going to share with you all is a song written with Giuseppe Bulla, and this song was written in the city of Sassari, so in the northern part of the island. And this is a song called On a Rooftop. And we'll provide the lyrics as a Word doc in the Zoom chat so that you can follow along that way if you want to watch them. The thematics for this song, so it's about the city of Sassari, and in this particular case, mostly about Giuseppe's experience of being from and living in this particular city. And the thematics that came up in the co-write, so the prompt for this was a prompt that Giuseppe came up with, and the prompt was rooftop. So we did free writing on this idea of rooftop. And so what came out is what it means to be socialized in a historically agrarian agricultural society where there's a huge amount of social cohesion and where there's a lot of social pressure and social expectation in the present moment to be sort of very present, very social in a lot of different ways, in the ways that this signifies particularly in Mediterranean cultures and in Italy as well. There's a guidebook that I was reading a couple months ago that refers to something known as, it's talking about Sardinian hospitality, and it refers to it as oppressive hospitality, in the sense that it can be almost impossible to say no if once you receive an invitation. So this is one of the thematics that came up in our co-write. Another line that you'll hear that came up for us is Mediterranean middle of nowhere. And here the idea was trying to get at these ideas that Giuseppe was sharing about social marginalization and about a sense of sort of being on the periphery or isolation from both the Italian mainland as an artist, as a musician, as a Sardinian, and also from the rest of Europe. So this sense of sort of being a part, the push and the pull of that, both the beauty of that, it's an incredibly beautiful place, and the freedom of that, and also the sense of sort of not necessarily having the full access that he might want as an artist. This song was recorded rather than in my house in a studio setting, so you'll hear a slightly more produced sound. With this song, a couple other things that you can listen to when I play it, you'll hear some Sardinian sort of a nod toward a guttural singing style in Sardinia that comes from a 4-part singing style called canto a tenore or canto a concordo also. And so you'll hear like a guttural voice at a couple points, and that's sort of what that is referencing and why that was put in there. And this song was recently performed at a music festival, a jazz festival called Time and Jazz that was started by the Sardinian jazz artist Paolo Fresu a couple weeks ago. So those are some of the themes to listen for. If you want to stick headphones on as I play this, I invite you to do that, and I'm gonna pull this up for us. Oops. Okay, pull that up again. All right. So Megan, maybe I'm going to start playing this. Just give me a thumbs up that you're hearing the sound, if that's okay.
City, it's hot as hell. Out of breath, escape to the stairwell. Memories follow me everywhere, but can they find me here? On my rooftop, weightless and free. Why am I singing? What am I doing up here? Why this need to see from afar, like a migrant bird passing by chance on a rooftop, on a rooftop. In my white stone city, it's hot as hell. Mediterranean, middle of nowhere. Invite all my friends, send them away again. There's life on this roof, and life on the moon reminds me there is something greater. Something shines from far away. She observes me above the roof, above it all. like a migrant bird passing by chance on a rooftop, on a rooftop, on a rooftop.
Okay. So thank you all so much for listening, and thank you for the feedback in the chat. That was super lovely. I think I'll share the second one, and then if you have any specific comments that you want to share via voice, we can take a little pause there before we segue. So the second song that I want to share with you all, let's see, let me go ahead and pull this back up. Okay, you see that? No?
No, just a black screen right now.
I did that again. Okay, let's try it one more time. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share and do it again just to see if that helps. Okay. How about now? Oh. Let's bring your shared window to the front. Okay, so nothing.
We can see your screen, but it's just not like full screen. Like it's showing up right now.
Okay, so let me just enlarge it and see if that.
Okay, yeah.
How's that?
For some reason, when you go into full screen mode, I don't know why it's just going all black. Is everyone else seeing black, or is that just me? You're seeing black too? Okay, like a black screen.
How about that?
No.
Nothing. Jeez.
Worst case scenario, we could just have it be a minimum, a smaller. Oh, yes,
Yeah,
now. Yeah, it's working now. Yes.
Okay, so maybe so you can see the small one now. Okay, should I just leave it like that perhaps?
It's full, yeah, it looks good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the second song that I wanted to share is, so it was written with Enrico Spanu, and his project name, if you want to check out his music, is The Heart in the Void. Fantastic singer-songwriter. And so this song is called Siamo tornate, and this is We're Going Back in Sardinian. And this is a different sort of a song. This was a commissioned song. It was commissioned by a nonprofit in Sardinia called Associazione Badesaligas. And then the engineer is Fabio De Montis, and then me and Matteo Scano and Enrico Spanu are on the recording. But the things that I want to share with you really briefly about the song, so you know a little bit about it before we listen to it. So it was commissioned with a ton of very, very specific parameters. So for an artist and for a songwriter, that makes things really, really challenging. So first of all, they selected me because they knew my music, and they wanted a song that could function. The work that this nonprofit does is trying to help young Sardinians who have moved abroad with the larger thematics of unemployment in Sardinia. And to help create jobs and create work on the island. And so they're inviting Sardi to sort of come back to the island, and they'll assist them with resources and other things. And so they wanted the song to function as an invitation or a hymn to sort of encourage, and it was used on their promo material and all sorts of stuff like that. But they also wanted a song that didn't sound stereotypically Sardinian, because for young people, they thought, well, that's not going to be exciting or interesting, and that's sort of like old hat. And so they wanted the exoticness of what they perceived as an American country sound. and particularly of an American country singer. So they asked that I be the one to sing on this particular song. And then they wanted the song to be in a mix of Italian, Sardinian, and English. So they wanted the choruses to be in English, they wanted the verses to be in Italian, and then they gave us very specific phrases in Sardo that they wanted incorporated into the song. So for example, Siamo tornando was one of them, we're coming back or we're going back. Cariños de luna was another one, like the caress of the moon. And for those of you that are Spanish speakers, if it sounds kind of Spanish, that's because Sardinia was colonized by Spain for 500 years. So there's a huge amount of Spanish influence in Sardo. So they wanted an American sound that sort of brings young Sardinians home. And then I reached out to Enrico to make it a collaborative work and to sort of have him assist me linguistically and everything else. They also wanted the sound of a harmonica. And again, when I asked them, and for me, this was part of sort of the ethnographic moment in writing this particular song, why do you want an American songwriter to write this song? There's a ton of amazing Sardinian musicians and songwriters on the island that can do it really, really well. I was told, and this was sort of an amazing moment, they said that I was the flamingo. And I said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, Sardinia is very well known for its flamingos. And the idea was that the flamingo always comes home and comes back and brings people and brings others with it. So this idea of sort of a continual return, and they knew that I had been returning to Sardinia for 4 years and sort of had my own migrational pattern of returning to Sardinia. And so they said, you know, you were the flamingo that sort of sonically in their vision, right? I should frame it in their very specific idea and vision of the song, that this song would serve in that way. The final thing maybe to just say here is that it was a very, very tricky mix because they wanted it to sound a little Sardinian, but not too Sardinian. So there were all these things that we were sort of trying to negotiate. And so I'm gonna play this song for you now. This one will have the words provided on the screen as we listen. So this is Siamo tornando.
Pioggia pasado. Io sarò la tua Sardegna, scalza sopra questa terra, vuoi assecondare il tempo, passando dall'autunno all'inverno. Siamo scorranne e la comunità cambia, ma è sempre più bella. Il centro del mondo nel centro di te stesso.
Okay. Let's see. So we can take a couple moments here for questions or comments if you all like, and then we'll do we're going to do some writing on our own as our own brief writing exercise. But are there thoughts that anyone wants to voice via voice? I've had a chance to look over the chat, and thank you for those. There's a question there that I can respond to as well.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So this is like a really rich and deep and interesting song, and I'm just curious, can you go over how was it used again? And then maybe it sounds very different than the one with Giuseppe, and so I'm wondering if you could also talk about how it was recorded.
Yeah. So this song we did a live take, and this one was recorded in the house in the village, so not in the studio. So you can hear sort of sonically, there's a pretty distinct difference. We did it in one take. We did one take, we liked it, and we kept it, which is somewhat unusual. You know, usually you can be pretty obsessive and do a bunch of takes. And then as far as sort of the process of it, is that the other part of your question?
I remember you saying that it was used in some, like, I think advertising for the nonprofit, and I guess
Yeah.
how was it used?
So social media, it was the soundtrack to a promo film that they were showing, particularly in Germany and in Austria and in Scotland, where a lot of expatriate, very young Sardi, primarily in their 20s, are working and have gone for work, as a way to sort of, you know, encourage people to come home. And yeah, so mostly in their social media, film, and promo materials that they wanted to show, and then also the events that they held in the community of Badesaliges, where they're based out of, to sort of play when people were entering the room and exiting the room, before and after events that were hosted by that particular association.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Anybody else? Comments or questions about that? Yeah. Ava, hey.
Hey, question about in the first song, that idea of the migrant bird. I immediately think of Hamid's Exit West, and just looking at the Mediterranean, of a place that's just, you know, in the midst of so much exile and people who are refugees. And even if Sardinia isn't exactly like an anchor point, did that play into it? I mean, it feels as if because of this rich history of exile, in a sense, there's like something about that floating in space there.
Yeah, and sorry, the line, you were saying Mediterranean, middle of nowhere?
It was a migrant bird.
Oh, sorry, migrant bird, yeah. I'm trying to go back into the process of the co-write and remember what I can remember, and I don't know if this will speak to your beautifully elaborated larger connection in question, is that the desire in the song was to kind of get a bird's eye view on this place known as Sardinia. So both like the rooftop, right? Sort of escape to the roof to maybe get away from one's friends, or sort of have space, or you invite them and then you send them away again, right? But also to sort of be like that migrant bird, right? To be passing by, to not have like the push and the pull family and of obligation and sort of all, as we all know, right? Like the pressures and the beauties and all of that sort of comes with our social connections and our social ties. You know, so like, what would it be like to be like a migrant bird? And sort of, and then there's I think later we use the reference of the moon, right? So these things that are sort of looking down from above, on top. But the larger thematics of migration are very, very, and it's a beautiful insight. I mean, they are very relevant in Sardinia. It's sort of a stopping point and a waypoint historically and in the present moment, also for migration to Italy, right? Both when it's accepted and when it's refuted in recent Italian political moments. So I think there are absolutely connections and extrapolations that could be made there too. Yeah. Anybody else questions at this moment? And then we can also open up at the end for other ones, for those that would like to.
Are you planning on translating this song like entirely into Sardinian or entirely into English? And if so, how would you do so?
Joseph, that is an excellent question. So we have an English translation in the works that Enrico, when he comes to tour in the US and perform specifically in Albuquerque, is planning to perform in English. So that's, we started that a couple weeks before I left. And then I think not into Sardinian, not for this one. Maybe because of the sort of mission statement of the song as it was commissioned for us, right? Which had its own complicated relationship, I think, to Sardinian and to Sardinian identity and all of those sort of things. So English, yes. Sardinian, not on the radar at this particular moment. Although I will say that the Sardinian words we were given are from the prestige variety of Sardo, known as Logudorese, and that in itself was a really interesting choice, right? It's known as the Sardinian of the poets, this particular variety. So even there was sort of very specific linguistic choices being made. Siamo storanne, all those phrases, cariños de luna. So thank you, great question. All right, any other questions at this point? I can't see all of you because of the screen share, but I can hear you if you want to raise your voice. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just jump ahead to this final portion, and then pretty soon, just as a heads up, you're gonna pull out a notebook and a pen, and we're all gonna do a little writing. Okay. All right. So this is the fieldwork that I was doing, and for roughly 10 months in Sardinia, and then this thing known as the global pandemic hit in Italy, and as you all know, everyone has now experienced their own iteration of this and their own version of this. And so my own research shifted with that, right? In the sense that I was no longer able to play shows and do live performances. And so one of the things that came up when that research started shifting is I started, because, you know, one of the questions I think for those of you, and also those of you in the Honors College and in the musicology program and everyone else that's attending across campus, as ethnographers or people that are doing any sort of face-to-face research, right, in this particular moment, like what does that mean and what does that look like, and how do we sort of make an L-turn, or how do we readjust and sort of factor that into our research? And so for me, one of the questions always becomes like, well, what do I have access to, right? I didn't have access to face-to-face communication. I did have access, of course, to Zoom. And I will say that the interviews that I was able to do over Zoom were some of the most intimate interviews I've ever done. I think actually people not being in the room actually provided a lot of liberty for people to sort of open up. Also, people were isolated in their houses and really wanted to connect and wanted to talk. So that became a very powerful thing. The other thing that I started paying attention to a lot more was social media and memes and live and chat. So I am a member of a number of very, very lively WhatsApp chat groups in Sardinia that are my Sardinian language classes and groups. And so this incredible wealth of media, and particularly of songs, started to be shared in these particular spaces. So one resource that I just wanted to share with folks, and if it's interesting, and we'll also provide a link, is this crowdsourced document by Deborah Lupton, Doing Fieldwork in a Pandemic, which sort of helps us and those of you all that are doing thesis projects and everything else to sort of think that through. And so that's a really, really helpful source. But one of the things that really, really struck me in all of this was not just the social distancing and the sort of sense of distance that created for all of us from one another, but the silence that came with that. So not just the distance, but that people stopped talking to one another and stopped creating sound. And so it felt like this incredible void in this very, very often sort of noise-filled and very verbal place. And so the absence was very, very marked and very powerful to observe. And so one of the things that came out of this for me was new ways to pay attention to politics between northern and southern Italy and between Sardinia and the mainland. And so one piece that came out of that, sort of from that experience, is a piece that I published for the Anthropology journal, the online journal Sapiens, which is an incredible magazine for those that want to check it out, about sort of balcony concerts and music and sound and all of these things that did come out of that silence, right? The verbal silence, the social distancing. And I got to participate in some of them, playing on my own balcony, and the incredible songs that were written and shared during this particular time. A meme that I'll share with you really briefly, this is one that circulated a lot, just to give you a sense of these tensions I'm talking about between North and South in Sardinia, is this particular meme. This is a famous mural from the community of Orgosolo that was repurposed, right, by Radio Limbara. And so the rough translation is, when your nephew from the Continente, from mainland Italy, arrives in Sardinia, fleeing from the virus, and he says, I just came by to say hello. So this sort of disingenuous, and of course, for, you know, the virus in Italy started in the north, right? And so during those first couple weeks, what happened is that northerners that, you know, didn't necessarily want to be in lockdown, who had second homes in Sardinia, came to Sardinia, and in some cases carried the virus with them. And so there are already a lot of tensions between Sardinia and the mainland, and many Sardis see Italians as their colonizers and see Italy as a colonizer. And so there for a long time already been sort of resentments under the surface and sometimes more openly, but this particular moment of the virus and the way that it played out in Sardinia became one of these moments. And so this meme for me sort of exemplified this in a lot of ways, right? Like, yeah, your nephew is sort of just showing up at this moment in time and saying, hey, grandma, I just came by to say hello, right? And so the response of sort of the militarized response in the case of this particular image. But I guess the takeaway here, and just because I was also asked to speak about this a little bit, is that I don't think our research has to stop. And I'm sure many of you have already figured this out in 1,000 different ways, right, in this moment. But it can be this sort of introspective moment to figure out other things that are going on. And then the question becomes, as ethnographers, as students of culture and of sound and of music, like, how do we get at those things through other means? And what is available, and what are our resources in a given moment? Okay, so what I thought I would do with our remaining couple minutes, and this will be a real brief exercise, and then we'll stop the screen sharing and open up for a broader conversation, is to do the sort of early stages of what writing a song on your own or collaboratively might look like. And so what I invite you to do now is to grab something to write with and something to write on, and then I'm going to give you all a prompt. And I'll give you a couple sort of guidances along this prompt. And some of you are already experts at this. We have a couple songwriting folks in the group, and I'm sure we also have some folks that do creative writing and other things. And so I'll give you a couple instructions on this. So I'm going to give everyone about 5 minutes to write this exercise. It's 4 now, so we'll have till 4:05. What are the rules? There aren't really any rules. There's no right or wrong, but try to silence the critic, which will always come in and tell you that whatever you're writing is crazy or makes no sense or anything like that. You can tell the critic to go sit in the corner for 5 minutes. Try to keep your pen flowing on the page. Don't worry at all about grammar Don't worry about sentences, and definitely don't worry about rhyming. So the goal here is not to rhyme at all. It's to sort of do a free associated, free write, okay? And anything that comes to mind is completely valid. This is one of the prompts that I used in some of my early co-writes in Sardinia. It's one I often share with my songwriting classes. And the idea here is that each person writes on their own, and then one of the next steps would be on a shared prompt, and then one of the next steps would be to share what you've written with another person, always optional. You can always self-edit in terms of what you're comfortable sharing. And then to find the commonalities between what you've written and what the other person has written, and thus begin sort of a process of whittling and focusing what that song might be about. Does that make sense as a general working idea with folks? Yeah? Okay, so I'm gonna read the prompt here, and then I'll set a timer. And then when you're done, I'm gonna ask maybe up to 5 folks to volunteer and share what they've written with all of us here. So just so you have that in your mind and you can decide if that feels comfortable for you. So here's the prompt. Visualize a place that you really love. Be there, see the details. Now write about it. It could be a corner of your bedroom, an old tree you sat under one whole summer, a table at McDonald's in your neighborhood, a place by the river. What colors are there? Sounds, smells. When someone else reads it, she should know what it is like to be there. She should feel how you love it, not by your saying you love it, but by your handling of the details. Okay, happy writing, and we will meet back at 4:06. So I'll give you guys about 60 seconds to wrap up. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop my screen share now so we can open up and do some sharing of our writing. Okay. So, how's everyone doing? And what intrepid souls do we have that would like to share something that they just wrote based on this prompt? I know it was short. Feel free to elaborate on it when you're done with the conversation today. And also feel free to share them with me if you're so inspired through my UNM email. Who would like to share? Is this, perhaps, is this Esme who is saying they would like to share? It's a little hard to tell. Okay. Okay. So if you'd like to share, I would say probably use your voice because I'm not able to see everyone's screen at the same time.
I'll share.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. This is my first song, so. Okay, the grit between my toes has an ebb and a flow. As the tide rises and falls, the smell of salt fills my head and the sun warms my back.
Beautiful,
Yes.
thank you. Really nice sense-bound writing. The grit, right? Were some of you there? Could you picture it? Yeah? Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Who else would like to share? And just to give you some parameters, like if there's parts you want to edit, you don't have to share it all. It's completely based on your comfort level. And I know this is a large group and we don't all necessarily know each other, so that could be a little bit scary too. Another way is you're welcome to write it in the chat if you'd prefer to do it that way, if you'd rather not use your voice. Anybody else feeling intrepid?
I'll share mine.
Okay.
I didn't try to write it in a song kind of form. I just wrote it free.
Excellent. That's how it starts. Yeah. You usually start very, very freely and then sort of shape later. Go ahead.
There was a backyard to a rental Landrum metal house that I will always remember fondly. There were apple trees and herb bushes like Russian sage. That summer bloomed, and Abby the cat chased a lizard around and around, stirring up dust and the smell of husky floral scented leaves.
Beautiful, thank you. Really, really beautiful. Russian sage immediately caught my ear. Really, really rich descriptions of nature and of plants there. How about for others of you? Any parts that stayed with you or that you remember from what Aubrey just read? You didn't necessarily know you were going to have to repeat it.
I think the temporality of it, like just being pulled into the past, into a memory.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, like these super, super rich, sort of thick memories, right? Is the way we could think about them. Who else would like to share?
Joseph said the cat chasing the lizard.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a really, really strong image. Nice. Okay, so we have, how about if someone would like to, we have time for one more person. If anyone would like to read what they wrote.
I'd like to share.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Home is where the heart is. In my heart is the strength of the choir, preaching out in a frenzy of love and kindness and godliness. The choir, made of bespectacled young teenage children with spare issues that they wish to escape through song. Bright blue music with green rhythms and fiery spirits understand that the world is in the chests of every girl and boy in the chorus. Nothing matters, no organic pressure or stenches of cologne or fear of icons or other such notoriously unimportant throes in the real world. For the taste of a melody is one that we shall all savor and experience. Honeysuckle with a slight tang of lime wine. Forced tension loses itself in the eyesight, the smashing golden berries of straws, piercing the night of the day, turning the stars into flowers resting on our heads.
Wow, Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Before I say anything else, any things that stay with you guys? Can you still recall any of it? Little words or phrases?
I hope I have this right, but was it honeysuckle with lime wine? That was so beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, I agree. I think that just like the way that you described like a melody with taste, I think that was awesome.
Yeah, someone else wrote honeysuckle in the chat, Joseph. That was seconded by someone else. You had a line of speckled something towards the beginning.
Here it is. Bespeckled young teenage children with spare issues that they wish to escape through song.
The whole idea, for me, it makes me think, as an anthropologist, it makes me think about like the social role of song and music and the way that you're talking about it sort of being in people's chests. And then it's very, very powerful. Beautiful. Yeah. Any other phrases that stay with folks from that particular one? Okay, thank you for sharing. So now I think we have about 15 minutes left if we'd like to use them to just open it up to general questions and discussion. Again, to circle back to where we left, this could be about questions about the Fulbright program. This could be questions about the portions of the research that I shared with you all today. It could be about the process of songwriting, or really anything in the interstices between there. So we'll just open it up at this point. And again, the questions can also come via the chat if you'd rather not identify your voice. And I have that open now so I can see those as they come in, if you prefer.
I have a quick question about like the process of writing, co-writing a song. Sure. So I mean, this was a great exercise to get us just like in the mind space of like, how do you use words to sort of paint this experience for someone? But when you're doing that with someone else or multiple people, you know, what is the process like? Are you sort of like brainstorming? Do you create a prompt for one another? Do you like, how does that evolve over time? And how do you get to a point where you're like, this is the final and
yeah, I mean,
what are the negotiations?
That's a beautiful question. As my songwriting students, you know, usually learn really quickly, collaborative writing takes probably at least, you know, 2 or 3 times the amount of time, right, than writing on your own. Although the other thing to say about it is that when you write songs collaboratively, like in any artistic collaborative work, you write songs that you absolutely never would have been able to write on your own, or wouldn't even have thought to write, right? Like, oh my God, that's amazing. Or it's sound in a totally different way. It looks in different forms, and it's a great question. So the whittling process, so let's take this prompt just so we have something grounded.
Yeah.
So you and I both just free wrote on this, okay? You would share what you wanted to share with me, and I would actively take notes, and I would stop you if there was a phrase I really liked. So, you know, like what we were doing with Joseph a little bit, okay? So, oh, wow, okay, I'm gonna write that down. And then we reciprocate, I do the same thing there. And then we read back to each other the things that we just wrote down, the things that we liked the most from what each other had. And then there's that sort of critical moment where you're like, okay, do these link? What do they share? What's interesting? And then maybe more importantly, where's the energy or where's the juice? Like, does it feel like there's, and then from there, usually the next part is a conversation. Okay, so what is this song about? Based on these things that and a lot of it has to do with mood and what people were thinking that day and what they came into the co-write with, right? And then we sort of put that on the table. And then that's usually when you start talking about the song structure. Like, okay, this song is about, you know, any particular theme that we can think of, and then the narrative question becomes, how do we tell that story, right? So in verse 1, it's going to talk about this, and then verse 2, and then by the chorus, we have to have arrived at this other theme that the chorus is going to talk about, right? And the chorus is much broader and sort of has to encompass the whole song, and so we figure out how we want to plot the narration. And then a lot of times you're putting just ideas down for each of those verses, not worrying. Usually rhyming is the very, very last stage. So because the rhyme, and all of us, right, have succumbed to this, the desire to sort of do trite rhymes, right? Which then take us very much away from the theme and the idea of what we're actually trying to communicate. So we sort of start with the ideas and the concept and the rawness of the words, and then we manipulate and massage them into a rhyme scheme as the absolute last sort of thing. And then oftentimes around that stage is when a melody or a chord progression will sort of come into the room. Like, oh, if it's about this, what about this, right? And then you sort of, and so there's a whole series of sort of guidelines that can be really helpful to use. One of them is like, you know, is sort of not saying no, because that can be like an energy stopper. And so if you don't like an idea, say yes and then try it. And then the chances are, if it isn't right for the song, that will usually, the process can move pretty quickly. So then it oftentimes will get jettisoned anyway. But to say yes and try it, and then you sort of make those assessments with your collaborator. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And yeah, it would be, if anyone decides to, you know, to go on with the process, it would be exciting to sort of see what people come up with, or who, who decides to move forward or try to write a song with it. Any other questions?
So I'm going to come at this from sitting in organization, information and learning sciences, and thinking about global e-learning. So we're talking about these very active WhatsApp chat groups.
Yeah.
Was there just also, was some of this also kind of with like a wisdom community that kind of was evolving because songs were growing out of this in order to make points about things going on in politics or to like show social activism? This could actually be like an activity that could be used like in an e-learning context to create that collaborative mutual growth process.
Tell me a little bit more what you mean by wisdom communities. That's a really interesting idea.
One of our professors at UNM basically has gone from looking at community of practice, and in her 2020 edition of this book, they're now looking at it as a wisdom community and really trying to develop means in online learning that require being sensitive to cultural diversity and actually incorporating and using it and using that whole participatory dialogue to push knowledge further and create knowledge artifacts. And so a song to me seems like an ideal artifact, knowledge artifact.
What a beautiful way to phrase it. Yeah, I love that idea. Yeah, I mean, so to go back to your to the question about the WhatsApp chat groups, yeah, I think, I mean, the lockdown in Italy was so severe and so sudden. So it went from one day to another. And then just to give everyone a sense, like, you know, we were allowed to leave where we were living once a week with a signed authorization to get groceries. And that was absolutely it. And so for people that didn't have a balcony or didn't have windows, you know, like there was some very, very severe, it was really hard on a lot of people. And so I think it was also just like, yeah, out of this incredible sense of deprivation and difficulty, and deprivation in the sense of social deprivation and of eye contact and face and sometimes light also, right? And it became sort of people's lifelines. I mean, the chats, I've never seen chats that were so active in this way. And then, yeah, and then songs, so both humorous songs as sort of social commentary, a lot of songs in the Sardinian context also about sort of this idea of Northerners showing up in Sardinia, and I discuss a couple of those in the Sapiens piece I referenced. But it does feel like there was some collective wisdom, for sure, sort of gained in those moments, and soothing one another became like, it really felt like a balm and a salve. The other thing that for me was very, very powerful was getting to perform like a balcony concert. You know, just to like make sound in a public space, or public in the sense that, you know, from my doorway, but like being able to share it with others. It felt sort of rebellious and a little radical, and just really, really amazing to sort of be able to do that. Yeah, thank you for your question. Other questions?
I have a question. So I think your album, am I correct in thinking it's in mastering now? It was recorded in June and now it's pretty much done, right?
Yeah, yep.
So I guess I'm wondering about the thematics that show up on the album. If you could speak to some of those, like maybe like the larger ones, because we looked at some of the thematics in specific songs, but maybe ones that run throughout the album.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll give you sort of where I'm at with that process, because some of it, you know, I'm still figuring out myself as I figure out which ones to include with the book and where and all of those kind of things. certainly this idea of belonging has been a very, very recurring theme. Identity and belonging, what does it mean to belong to this particular island nation known as Sardinia? How is that expressed? How is that separate or distinct from being Italian, right? Because, you know, there's sort of dual identities, at least, going on in this case, as Sardinian and as Italian. I would say this idea of social marginalization came up in a lot of songs in different ways. And then also, but also marginalization, for example, within one's own community or within one's own village. One song, for example, is about an individual that grew up in a rural fishing cooperative in Sardinia. And then there was some infighting and some really awful things that happened. And they sort of no longer were allowed to belong to that community anymore, and the sense of loss and sort of finding identity and place in other places as a result of that. So, you know, also searching for it within Sardinia, not just abroad or sort of between Sardinia and the Continente and Italy or other places. Those are the big thematics that I can think of off the top of my head that sort of seem like, you know, and this is sort of when we think about, like, is something an article or is it a book, and how do we sort of link all of this, right? This is one of the things we sort of look for, these larger umbrellas that sort of encapsulate all of the things that we're trying to cover or to talk about. So I'd say those are like the ones that seem most consistent from song to song.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Anybody else? Any final questions, clarifications?
I'm sorry, I don't want to like hog the question thing here. So if there is another question, but I am a little bit curious. Did you hear I mean, I would think that Corsica then is sort of the French version of that. Like, is that anything that you were also aware of, or was that in any sense?
In terms of Corsican music specifically, or?
Yeah, and also like that whole identity and belonging. There's also any kind of cross-pollination.
We have some folks from Sardinia on this call, so if you want to intervene or sort of add your own take to this in Italian or in English, but I'm happy to translate if you'd like to contribute. Yeah, no, I have not been to Corsica. I've certainly listened to amazing 3-part a cappella Corsican music. By all accounts, Sardinia and Corsica, politically and otherwise, are very, very distinct, and sort of have handled sort of independence and what it means to be independent in very, very different ways. So perhaps the larger analysis is that despite the ambivalence Sardi have about also being linked to the Continente and to Italy, that they are more linked to it than Corsica is to its former colonizer, to France. Is sort of very, very broad brushstrokes. And as I understand it, that also sort of manifests itself in the singing style and sort of in sound, in terms of what's treated thematically. Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And I'm very, very excited to have an opportunity to go there sometime and visit. Yeah, did anyone want to add to that that's listening in, or that has experience with Corsica or Sardinia? Okay. Fantastic. Maybe this is a good time to wrap up, Megan?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a lovely presentation, super engaging. Thank you. I'm sure everyone feels similarly that it's been very engaging. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation. It was good to get to know you virtually. Okay.